TNTRadio.live.
Check it out.
Today's News Talk Radio.
It's the coolest.
TNT.
Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. We're in hour number 2, this live broadcast. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. Thank you for joining us. Big thank you to everybody in the TNT chat room. See, we got near 100 people in there in the previous day. So great to see the numbers building up on this time slot. Appreciate you guys keeping it real in there. And back to U.S. politics, and really a continuation of the amazing conversation we had last hour with international human rights lawyer Dan Kovalik. I want to welcome onto the program the director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, Daniel McAdams, joining us on the live link right now. Great to have you with us, Daniel.
Thanks so much for having me back on, Patrick. I appreciate it.
Daniel, it seems like with every passing week, we have things that we're looking at. You're in the news business. You produce a daily show, I think, with the Ron Paul, the Liberty Report with the Ron Paul Institute. You're looking at the slate, and you think the plate's full, Daniel, and then the weekend happens, and the plate just got twice or three times as big of major issues. This seems to be the case now. Things are heating up. I really wanted to first get your reaction on what you think is happening in Europe, because we're going to have this conversation earlier, but the European elections, how significant, not significant? Are we seeing any shift going on in European politics, Daniel?
I think it's a huge shift. I mean, I think the most significant thing is the destruction, the decimation of the Green Party in Germany, and they're just completely delusional. I mean, Baerbock says now she wants to go for chancellor. I mean, they lost, 20 points in this last election, in the European elections. So they're absolutely delusional. They were formed, I remember, in the 70s and 80s as a peace party, the anti-nuclear weapons party. They were the Reds, the Green Reds, and now they're the war party. And so they're absolutely delusional. So I think absolutely the European voters are disgusted and sick of what they've been served up on their plate. What I wonder about now is what are the quote unquote far right going to actually look like? I followed Marine Le Pen for a long time. In fact, I followed her father, an interesting political figure to be sure. But she has, maybe for political reasons, but she's consistently sort of drifted toward the center now. So I wonder if she actually does get close to, well, obviously not direct power, but cohabitation she certainly will have influence in her party. So I wonder how far to the center she'll return, particularly when wondering about the possibility that Macron may, throw in his beret and just quit,
It's certainly not looking good for Macron, although he might get a stay of execution there. But the controversy over his wife, Candace Owens, seems to have lit a fire underneath that issue. That'll be interesting going forward. But the real anti-war bloc, though, in Europe, some EU countries, another non-EU country, Robert Fico, Slovakia, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Alexander Vučić made a very powerful statement on camera this past week, saying that the train has already left the station in terms of a major war between NATO and Russia, and he fears that Europe's being pulled into that. So you have that kind of anti-war bloc forming in Central Europe. It's almost like a bulkhead between the West and Russia. But is that enough, Daniel? Do you see any potential fissures forming? I mean, the Polish election results are very interesting. They kind of follow that trend that you just identified in Germany. But what about staving off this inevitability of this war that everybody seems to be talking about?
I mean, Poland seems like the classic Tom Woods line: whoever you vote for, you get John McCain. You have Dumb and Dumber, Bad and Badder when it comes to peace. I've never been that confident in Vučić. I think he's sort of he tends to talk. He reminds me a little bit of Erdogan, although Erdogan at least does it for profit. I think Vučić does it out of fear. He talks on one side of his mouth and on the other. I think Fico is the real deal. Fico's been in politics for a long time. He reminds me of Viktor Orban in that he has shifted his sort of philosophy and political orientation over the years, not because he's slippery and slimy, as a lot of politicians do, but because he has matured, he has evolved, He has a realpolitik look at the world. So I think he's the real deal. And I wonder, where there might be others who will emerge. It's not happened in Italy. Meloni was supposed to be that person. She's not. I don't have any faith in the Netherlands under Wilders at all. The guy's a neocon. Le Pen we talked about. Who knows? But maybe the off day in Germany. They're certainly not going to win out and out, but they may have a lot more influence if they can find some common ground with the Sarah Wagenknecht and the left in Germany. Now that's where things I think could be interesting.
Yeah. There are some interesting alliances forming between people on the left. France as well, with Mélenchon has some similar foreign policy positions to Marine Le Pen vis-a-vis Ukraine, but not the same maybe regarding Israel. So you see these differences on these different issues. But on the U.S. side, the U.S.'s position on this, British's position on this, been very resolute. Give Ukraine whatever it wants, whatever it needs. We're gonna fund this in perpetuity. We're gonna line up finance and arms forever because we need to defeat Russia. And then when Zelensky defeats Russia, we'll then let him into NATO. That's the sort of rhetoric we're getting. We can't afford to lose. And we got this clip from Blinken, and I really want to get your reaction to this. This is Tony Blinken just a couple of days ago talking about this endless conveyor belt that they've constructed for Ukraine. Go ahead and roll this clip.
The supplemental, which passed Congress after many months, but it did pass, and it passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. We've now been working these recent weeks to speed all of that assistance to the front lines, to make sure that Ukrainians have what they needed in hand to deal with the ongoing Russian aggression. And we've seen, I think, that be very effective in terms of stabilizing the front lines and making sure that the Russians could be stopped in their offensive. It's making it a big difference. Of course, as we've said all along, what makes the biggest difference is the extraordinary courage and resilience of Ukrainians themselves, both in dealing with the challenges in Kharkiv and in the east, but also taking the fight as necessary to Russia and Crimea, as well as in the Black Sea. The bilateral assistance agreement that the United States signed just a few days ago, President Biden and President Zelensky, that marks now the, I think, 17th bilateral security agreement that's been signed.
I mean,
17th, that's going to do it, man.
Is another one. So what is the master plan here, Daniel, if there is one?
This guy's delusional. I mean, listen to him. How can anyone take this seriously? They've been able to stop Russia on the front lines. I mean, Russia continues to advance, taking village after village. They've opened a third front in Kharkov. They're threatening to open a fourth front in Sumy. All the Ukrainians are doing is dying along the way, And I mean, just to hear him say this, and it's just astonishing that there's no, casual observers of what's happening in Ukraine, people with basic skills, on the internet, on X and Telegram, whatever. I mean, you can see that this is absolutely not true. And I was listening to my friend Alex Christoforo earlier today, and I'm sure you listened to him. He's great, but he pointed out that just the recent few pledges, we're talking about another $160 billion. We've already pledged 170 before. I don't know how much the Europeans have pledged. How much money is going to be spent on an absolutely losing proposition that we know is not benefiting Ukraine? It's benefiting the connected military-industrial complex in the U.S. and to a lesser degree the Europeans. I mean, this is the biggest money laundering scheme in history.
And so we saw Giorgia Meloni just fresh out of the G7, one of their post or breakout sessions. I'm not sure what it was, and she's saying that if Russia doesn't, this was the peace summit in Switzerland. If Russia doesn't comply with the offer we're making, we're going to make them comply. So basically giving ultimatums to Russia. So a lot of tough talk. Daniel, my question is, if the United States wasn't as hawkish as they are on this issue, would the European countries or the G7 members be so hawkish? Or are they being hawkish under the wing of the U.S. on this issue?
Yeah, no, from what I heard, there was a slight mistranslation of what she actually said. But what she actually said wasn't that much better. She said something like, if we hadn't propped up Ukraine, they would have had to they would have had to give up already, which would have been to their benefit. I mean, giving up a year and a half ago would have been to their benefit. It would have been a good thing, not a bad thing. So I know that to your question, I mean, the Europeans have proven have proven themselves so supine, and not in deference to superior U.S. diplomatic front. I mean, supine in the face of the Anthony Blinkens and Jake Sullivans of really the least among us. You could pick, five Uber drivers somewhere in, Kansas or something, and they would do a hell of a lot better of a job than these so-called experts who, if you examine their career, and I think we talked about it before, Patrick, if you examine their careers, Sullivan and Blinken, they are people of literally zero achievement. They're not professionals in their field. They're not foreign policy professionals. They were thrown in there because of their loyalty to Hillary Clinton and to Barack Obama, and this is what you get. I very briefly when I was in grad school, I worked for James Baker, and this is a person, for better or for worse, was new foreign policy, and for a while I worked for Lawrence Eagleburger. These were people who knew at least the basics of foreign policy, and you just see it completely gone, and that's why we're in the situation we're in.
Yeah, like you said, for better or for worse, and what Dan Kovalek said was interesting in the last hour. Daniel, he said that the U.S. used to be able to wear the halo even when they were wreaking death and destruction in Vietnam and other places, but they still managed to have that image of an international broker among all that, but that halo is now gone. And this is one of the big problems, I think, that Washington's facing, that the cost that they're having to bear for the decisions they've made is going to hurt them going forward in terms of bringing coalitions together and getting consensus on stuff that they used to be able to do through the various means and methods. That's not going to happen now. You're seeing this at the UN. You're seeing this with BRICS. St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, some of the panel discussions there. People are already charting their own course in the 21st century, and the U.S. is not leading it. Your thoughts, Daniel?
Yeah, and even though I'm not a huge fan of the ICC for a number of reasons, that you could put that in the mix as well. In the ICJ, on the one hand, this administration has praised the International Criminal Court when they indicted Putin on very spurious charges. And then they did a 180 when they decided that, maybe killing, 17,000 kids and, 35,000 civilians, that might be a little bit much. So, the U.S. had an absolute panic attack when that happened. So you're right. I mean, we are not the isolationists, we non-interventionists. We want to engage in the world. The Blinkens of the world, the Sullivans of the world, the neocons who run things on the left and the right, they're the actual isolationists, and they've isolated us economically. You pointed out with BRICS. I mean, this is like there are new neurons being formed, like being regenerated in the world body now, as if you cut off a lizard's tail or something. New neurons are being formed, and the U.S. is left behind. So I would say economically and politically by BRICS, and we're being cut off morally by our incomprehensible fealty to the state of Israel. Which is conducting a slaughter in Gaza. So we've lost our moral authority as well. So what does that leave the U.S.? It leaves us with a big pile of worthless dollars that now, as a result of the St. Petersburg Forum and elsewhere recently in the last couple of months, in BRICS, you're seeing that will be irrelevant. What the Saudis have now said they'll accept yuan for oil. The dollar, the de-dollarization is proceeding apace, and it didn't have to be this way. Certainly not as quickly as it happened.
Yeah, the trend's already moving that direction, Daniel. But the velocity of it is really a result of U.S. policy, weaponizing their financial instruments and stealing people's $350 or billion from Russia, and then giving it back to Ukraine. But what are they doing with Ukraine, Daniel? The arms, the loans, the amount of loans they've stacked up on this make the IMF debt traps in South America and Africa of the last 40 years look like chump change. And then the laundering of that money, isn't this really just cycling back to the U.S. through defense contractors? It's all being underwritten by deficit spending at the end of the day, Daniel, isn't it?
The idea that you would give Ukraine a 50 billion or whatever $50 billion loan, I mean, that's like giving $1 billion loan to Hunter Biden. You know, the guy's not good for the money. I mean, certainly at this stage he's not. I mean, Ukraine is decimated economically, and you're right. It's just money laundering, and it's so untruthful. The idea that Ukraine, after you've destroyed, you've destroyed its ability to recover its economy because you've killed all the men, and now they're killing all the women. I've seen several photos of young attractive ladies in military fatigues now being dragged off to war. It's terrible. It's a decimation of an entire country. They're not going to be able to recover. It's going to take generations for them to recover from this.
That's the ultimate tragedy that I think we need to remind ourselves that what the price Ukraine has paid in terms of bleeding out the next generation of young men, especially, and others, is just unforgivable. All for what? It's a vanity war for NATO and the West at the end of the day. But you brought up this point about the amount of dead soldiers that they've had to endure. I'm going to play this report. This is, believe it or not, this was on the BBC. I was shocked that this was even aired. Okay, and it's a very important piece. And once in a while, they do good journalism, Daniel. Once in a while. And when they do, if they did, Daniel, we wouldn't be doing this, what we're doing here, by the way, just to remind people. But let's roll this report. So at the same time, Blinken is pushing weapons. This is the reality on the ground in Ukraine. They can't get people to fight. Go ahead and roll this BBC report. This is incredible.
Ukraine is facing one of its most perilous chapters since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, with Moscow's offensive getting ever more intense. The Ukrainian army desperately needs to enlist more troops, but more than 2 years into the war is struggling to find willing volunteers. Our correspondent Jean McKenzie reports from the city of Odessa.
At Sergei's wedding, it wasn't just the weather that didn't go to plan. Half of the guests didn't show up. Going out in public is now too risky for men who don't want to enlist. But the bride, Tanya, understands why her friends and family don't want to fight. Her father was killed on the front line.
Are you afraid that you might be caught and sent?
Yes, I'm afraid. I'm also afraid.
Of course I'm afraid too and don't want it. It happened twice in my family.
Public transport has become a no-go for those trying to avoid the draft. Conscription officers have a fearsome reputation for dragging people off buses and taking them to conscription centres. These officers are on the hunt for draft dodgers. It's hard to find willing soldiers these days, so now it's the law for men to register so they can be called up.
Are you part of the problem? Because people are hiding from you, they're scared of you.
Look, some people react aggressively towards us. Others run away from us. This happens often. I don't think these people have been well brought up.
These guys are having a pretty difficult time finding people who are eligible to serve, and they do accept that some people are hiding from them, but they are urging men to come forward because they say everybody has to play their part in defending this country.
Behind these walls, men are hiding at the very moment the Ukrainian army needs them the most. Russia, with its superior manpower, is on the offensive. This is Vova. He won't leave the house without checking these social media groups, which tell him where the officers are.
I don't walk outside at all now, unless I'm with my daughter, because they don't take people with their children.
The Ukrainian army says that it needs people like you to fight if it is to win this war.
I'm not a military person. I've never held a weapon. I don't think I'd be useful on the front line, but I know if I get drafted, this is where I'll be sent.
These men who are hiding, I don't consider them men. What are they waiting for?
Vlad was badly injured serving on the front line.
If we run out of men, the enemy will come to their homes, they will rape their women and kill their children.
Recruitment posters line the streets of Odessa. The message, together to victory. But Ukraine is now divided between those who are prepared to fight and those who would rather run or hide. Jean Mackenzie, BBC News, Odessa.
$7,000 for a deferment, Daniel. That's the going black market rate, we're told, to get the right paperwork. What an incredible scene. And that seems like a truthful report, a good bit of journalism, Daniel. It says a lot, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that they would even say anything is incredible. I mean, in terms of journalism, it was definitely pointed. It was basically saying, hey, these guys that won't fight, what a bunch of cowards, what a bunch of losers they are. But, you know, I think you probably saw the same statistic, and correct me if I'm wrong, but something like when these people are dropped to the front in Kharkov, the average time of life is 3 hours. So that doesn't sound like a good bet. That doesn't sound like you're defending the homeland. That sounds like you're cannon fodder. I mean, that sounds like, you know, when the Nazis were recruiting, 12-year-olds at the very end on the Russian front, on the Soviet front, and they were just getting chewed up. And that's what's happening to these young men. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have $7,000 laying around, and definitely I do not look good in a dress. But if I had to, a lot of the young guys are dressing up like gals. I'd probably try to get, my wife to fix me up with some makeup or something. And they just say, there's an ugly old broad. We're not going to take her to the front. I mean, I'm laughing, but it's absolutely tragic. All the guys that have drowned on the trying to cross the Tisa into Romania and trying to cross the border into Hungary. I think a few of them broke through the border and made it into Hungary last week. It was. I mean, this is not a country where people are enthusiastic about Zelensky and Zelensky's policy. This is a country that's ripe for a coup, and I think that's probably how this war is going to end.
I mean, incredible, pulling people off buses, actual press ganging. The numbers they never talk about. You're right about this, the propaganda element. I think the BBC was trying to get they interviewed these recruiters and said, these aren't real men. They don't want to serve. But that actually was an own goal. I think it made them look really bad and thuggish. And to show that, in a way, inadvertently or not, the BBC gave that impression off. But they don't talk about the numbers of casualties or the numbers of dead Ukrainian soldiers. This is a verboten figure. It's a verboten conversation. But if you go by a lot of the respectable estimates on this, and I would think that Scott Ritter and some of the other of his colleagues have quoted, well in excess of 350,000 men in 2 years, 2.5 years. I don't think that's too outlandish, Daniel. But if you're getting into that 400,000 number, that's the total number for World War II of U.S. servicemen. Are you getting close to that number there? I mean, people got to put this in proportion. This is like total devastation for Ukraine, for the future of Ukraine, what's left of Ukraine. I can't see how, there are not calls for negotiations at this point.
I mean, what I also can't see is, I know there are smart people at the Pentagon. There are people that understand how the military works. I'm sure they're trying to keep their heads down. But certainly experts in the military world had to have known from the beginning that Ukraine didn't stand a chance against Russia. I mean, they had numerical inferiority. They had inferiority in terms of weapons. They had, just on paper, I'm not a military person. I don't understand these issues. But I can see very clearly that when you have this disproportionality in terms of power projection, you're not going to win. And the types of weapons they gotten from the very beginning, the U.S. military doctrine, is based on interoperability. It's based on, the connection between land warfare and domination of the skies, and everything intercoordinates. What we gave the Ukrainians is a bunch of ragtag. Oh, here's some weapons from the U.S., here's some from the U.K., here's a German tank, here's a British tank. When you already have that built-in inferiority when it comes to force projection, and then you give them a bunch of stuff that nobody knows how to work or coordinate, it doesn't take a military genius to see that this is not going to end well. And the sad thing about Washington and the neocons who run things, they just don't care.
No, no, absolutely not. And the other thing that's come up in the news, Daniel, talk of conscription, selective service in the United States. This is in the UK. This has become an issue. They're talking about in Europe. These noises are not like coincidences, Daniel. There is an effort to bring back national service, to talk about conscription. Obviously, people are thinking this needs to happen. And we're even seeing this come on paper on Capitol Hill now. Your thoughts on this?
Well, this is where I channel my inner Lenin, the worse the better in some ways, although I'd hate to have conscription. I think it's slavery, and I think we got rid of slavery in the U.S., thank God, a while ago. Nevertheless, I think certainly in Europe, if you start grabbing Germans off the street, I think you're going to have a real concentration of opposition to this foreign policy. In the U.S., it hasn't really hit Americans yet. It's a far-off war, and as you pointed out earlier in our segment, Patrick, a lot of this money that's being spent is hidden, and it comes out in the form of taxation. And Americans don't understand, why am I paying so much for food? Well, it's because you're blowing a lot of money on Ukraine and elsewhere, but they don't see that connection directly. But if you start nabbing people off the streets, if you start registering young men and even young women they're talking about in the U.S., and you start sending them off to war against their will, that's when you're going to have a kind of realization that our foreign policy is not cost-free. There's a cost to being the world's aggressor, and it's going to come down to that. So as much as, God forbid, I'd hate to see it happen in the U.S., it will focus some people's minds on the cost of our aggressive foreign policy.
No, absolutely. Yeah, the worse, the better. There are people that also subscribe to that I've spoken to, Daniel. And it is true. It does need to get really bad to sort of wake people up these days, to get some kind of visceral reaction from the public. But on the issue of the nuclear talk has also escalated. I'm sure that's something that has alarmed you and your institute, because this is one of the very things that your organization is made for, is to raise the conversation and prevent these types of things from escalating in our political conversation in the United States and globally, peace and prosperity. That's your mission. What about all this talk of nuclear escalation that we're hearing from the U.S. side, from the NATO side, Stoltenberg, attacks on Russia, early warning radar systems, 1,000 kilometers inside Russia? I mean, that's a nuclear provocation by anyone's estimation. It used to be considered as much. Daniel, go ahead.
Well, I think as we know, as the decades have passed, a lot of the threat of the Cold War, a lot of the threat of the Soviet expansionism was overblown by the CIA, and that's a fact. But nevertheless, there was an ideological combat that took place during the Cold War. I grew up during the Cold War. I think to a degree you did as well, Patrick. And I remember what it was like. And even at the depths of the ideological a battle between godless communism and, wonderful capitalism and democracy, even as these battles raged over seemingly incompatible worldviews, the idea that we would have a nuclear confrontation, or that it would go to a nuclear conflict over this, was unthinkable. It was absolutely unthinkable. And you mentioned the attack on the long range radar inside of Russia. That would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. And here we have a conflict that is not based on any sort of radically ideologically different view necessarily. I think it's emerging, but that's another story for another time. But nevertheless, it's not communism versus freedom any longer. That's gone. That world is over. So why are they resurrecting it, not only in its worst aspects, but adding to it the twist of the potential use of nuclear weapons? I mean, I'm dating myself. I was in grad school at the end of the Cold War. And when we studied the elements of mutually assured destruction, we studied what a first launch looks like. We studied what a response looks like. I mean, this stuff, when it came out, was right at the end of the Cold War. It was like, good God, I mean, this is what they were planning all this time. Thank God we're over that. We're never going to go back to this idiocy. And here we are. We've gone back to this idiocy over nothing.
Well, mutually assured destruction, that was the underlying doctrine that held it all down and allowed that stalemate to maintain, that protected everybody. But Daniel, there's people that are in power now in the U.S., I hear them in the media, I hear them on Fox, and I see them at the RAND Corporation and other leading think tanks. They believe that they can overcome the mutually assured destruction doctrine and get a tactical advantage, and that they can prevail in a nuclear war against Russia. They're even saying in some places, don't listen to Putin. He's bluffing. He's not going to go through with it. I'm hearing this more often, and this does actually make me scared, Daniel, because this is a type of thinking that I really I'm really losing faith in people in these political positions if they're entertaining this kind of thinking. Because as you said, Daniel, this has already been gamed out. Game theory, it's already been proven. It's been mathematically worked out ahead of time. Computer simulations. It's total devastation. You reach a event horizon where you can't pull back. And there's people playing around with these concepts now. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, Putin is bluffing. Xi is bluffing. Kim Jong-un is bluffing. Everyone is bluffing. And don't take them seriously. It's astonishing. The thing that actually irritates me the most, Patrick, is that you don't see more Americans rising up in absolute fury at these people who are taking us to the brink of destruction. You had a great peace movement in the 60s. You had in the 80s, you had the anti-nuclear movement in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. Now here in the U.S., when I think that you're right, I mean, they played it out, but the threat is more real than it's ever been because the threat is so diminished. I mean, so like in people's minds, so diminished. It's no big deal. We'll lob some nukes, take care of the problem. And there's no people saying, what the hell is wrong with you people? There's no peace movement right now. And there's some rumblings of it, some on the right in the U.S. and some on the left in the U.S., but there's no coalescence of this kind of movement right now. And we need a catalyst. I don't know what it looks like. To be honest, not to get into politics, I'd hoped that it would be RFK, but it's not. It's not going to be him. So we don't have a catalyst right now that bring together this peace movement against the seemingly impending global destruction.
Well, one of the things that the Ron Paul Institute and Ron Paul himself has said over the years is, we have a framework in the United States. It's called the U.S. Constitution, separation of powers. We have checks and balances that if it's functioning, we have sound money and Congress has the power of the purse, if all of these things are working, the checks and balances more likely than not are going to prevent any of these outrageous outcomes from happening. And it helps to balance and distribute power in the world if the United States acts in accordance to those principles. That's what Ron Paul's been saying for the longest time. This is what your organization says, all of your members as well. That's still the message, I think. And I think, how do we get that kind of thinking back into the political economy of the United States?
Well, it's not going to come by electing a few more good people, although that doesn't hurt. And frankly, I mean, we've seen some anti-war votes where the Republican vote has been pretty good. I mean, you're talking 40 or 50 members on certain things, which is encouraging. Now, that may not be for the right reasons, but that's encouraging. But as Dr. Paul always says too, our government is a trailing edge of American public opinion. So when America decides that it's tired of this foreign policy, when it's tired of the threat of global destruction, the politicians will follow, because what do they love more than anything else? They love power. And they know if they don't follow the will of the people, they won't keep getting elected. So, I mean, that's why at the Ron Paul Institute, like you say, and the work that you do, we're just trying to educate people to the point where they will stand up on their own, form their own groups, and start pressuring the people in power to start listening to what we have to say.
Yeah, and also I think I'm very encouraged as well. There's a lot more young people. They understand the Federal Reserve System. They understand that deficit spending is what is allowing this imperial largesse to take place, and this is accruing now. They're saying the latest estimations here from the Financial Times, the U.S. will have a $50 trillion in debt by the year. They're saying by the year 2050, I think, or 2035. Sorry, 2035. I think it'll be before that, quite frankly, at the rate it's going right now. But that's the kind of source of a lot of the problems, Daniel, because not every country can run deficit spending like the U.S., and they don't. And we're able to do it because we have a reserve currency.
Which is going by the wayside now because of our foreign policy. We're killing the golden goose. But, could you imagine if, you had a bunch of credit cards, you racked up debt, and it's like, oh my gosh, just the interest payments on these stupid cards are more than I make my entire year in my job. We would go nuts. We would, I don't know what we would do. But the U.S. government say, hey, no, it's no problem. We'll keep going. Everything is fine. It's like that meme, the guy sitting in the fire room. Everything is fine. It's not fine. It's not fine. It's going to get a lot less fine very soon.
Yeah. So a 2024 election cycle coming up. Daniel, got a couple minutes left. What are your thoughts? This is the weirdest presidential election ever right now. Trump, Biden, got the down ballot races as well. A lot of Senate seats are open. I don't know which way this is going to go in the House. Your final thoughts here before we break for the hour.
Well, it's very interesting. I was just looking at a tweet by Ed Snowden that came out a few hours ago. And I don't know if you saw this, but Netanyahu released a video where he brutally attacked Biden and the Biden administration for not giving him enough weapons. And Snowden said, like, what kind of, imagine you've given up the ability to get reelected. You've given Netanyahu absolutely everything he wants. You've destroyed the base of your party in the service of Netanyahu. And he stabs you in the back like this at the very end. I mean, it's just astonishing to see this happen. But I think Bibi's looking around. He's no dummy. He may be evil, but he's no dummy. He's looking around. He's saying, hey, Trump's going to win this thing. So I better get in his good graces because I want to keep my killing machine going. I want to keep my butt out of jail. And so he's playing. There's no loyalty there. It's just business, as they say in The Godfather. And so I think it's pretty funny to see. So in terms of the presidency, Trump is maybe slightly less anti-war on some things. He's probably worse on Israel, in my opinion. Who knows? But the House and Senate, I honestly have not followed it closely enough to make any kind of prediction, to be honest with you.
One thing, Netanyahu's due to address Congress in not so long. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing in itself. Is this not going to trigger the mother of all protests? Because I'm just expecting that that's going to happen. He's not going to have a moment of quiet while he's in the Capitol. But it's bad optics, Daniel. Just got a minute left. Your thoughts on that?
It's super risky. I mean, I can't believe he's doing it. Thomas Massie was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, was talking about how, look, I'm the only no vote on this stuff. Why do I get so much heat? Why do I get so much grief? Well, it's the same thing with Netanyahu. He doesn't want to have any appearance of dissent among the American body politic. So if you see a big walkout among the progressives there, it's going to look very bad for him. And there's probably going to be some Republicans who don't go as well. If the camera pans the room and you see 10, 15, 20% of the seats empty, it's not a risk I would take if I was Bibi.
Yeah, even one ant is like that Disney movie, that kids movie, Ants. Even one dissenter, they can't handle that because then the other ants might get their own ideas. Daniel McAdams, Ron Paul Institute. Really appreciate you joining us this week on TNT, Today's News Talk.
Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate it.
And please visit the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Go to their website, ronpaulinstitute.org. There's great articles and analysis on there on a daily basis. Follow Daniel McAdams on X, Twitter as well. We'll drop those links in the TNT chat community. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And, of course, a big thank you